Hi, I'm Sasha Ayad. It's March 2025, and here's what's on my mind this month. Is our culture really okay with gay kids? In some ways, it seems like gay people and their experiences have been fully accepted and integrated into society. That the days of gay and lesbian people hiding in the closet or facing a lot of social stigma are way behind us, at least in progressive first world nations. For example, nearly everyone celebrates Pride Month, including corporations and institutions. Schools actively teach inclusivity, and homophobic slurs are frowned upon. None of this was the case just a few decades ago. But I have to ask, if we're really so comfortable with this, specifically in kids, why does it seem like so many children with noticeably gender nonconforming behavior are labeled as transgender these days rather than being recognized as likely to grow up gay? For a while now, I've had this nagging thought. At this particular moment in time, not all trans kids are gay, but nearly all would-be gay kids are trans. And if that's true, what does that say about how we actually feel about gender nonconforming children? Now, I'm obviously not the first person to point this out, but today I want to call out both sides, so to speak, because I think there are some subtle distortions that really need examination. Now, we can start with the obvious scenario. Let's imagine we're transported back in time to a few decades ago. It's the early 90s, and a little boy who insists on playing with dolls, wearing dresses, and hanging out with girls would have likely been seen as a future gay man. In fact, psychotherapist Catherine Turk wrote extensively about this. She herself had a very feminine son who later turned out to be a gay man, and she made this particular population of boys her area of focus. Similarly, in the 90s, a tomboyish girl who rejects everything feminine and realized she likes girls would eventually grow up to be a lesbian or bisexual. Everyone seemed to know that. And if you look at the statistics, it bears this out. A study began in 1989 that followed 139 boys with actual gender dysphoria, not just feminine behaviors, for several decades. The researchers, including Zucker and Singh, found that about 63% of the participants who reported their sexual interests were either gay or bisexual. And it turns out that a whopping 87.8% of those dysphoric kids desisted, meaning they grew out of their dysphoria and no longer wanted to become women. Only 12.2% persisted in their gender dysphoria. But today, it's likely that similar kids would get labeled as trans, told they're born in the wrong body, socially transitioned, and then even placed on puberty blockers, which starts a cascade of medical interventions that could last the rest of their lives. In fact, around the same time that the Zucker and Singh study was going on, Dr. Turk noticed a major shift in how parents regarded their feminine sons. In a 2007 paper, she wrote this about the parents in her listserv. In 2006, a trend began as more parents within the listserv felt their sons were transsexual girls rather than gay boys. This trend was initiated and supported by the intense interest in stories in the media of children beginning gender transition at early ages. Now, one such story, which came into public view a few years after Turk's paper, is that of Jazz Jennings, who also had a popular book and TV show called I Am Jazz, which tell the story of a boy who loved dressing in pink, playing with dolls, and pretending to be a mermaid. This means the child is a girl, of course. This is the trans kid narrative. This shift in how people understood feminine preferences in boys really accelerated in the mid-2010s, when cultural focus on the trans kid skyrocketed. So, of course, that brings us to the big question. Is society really more accepting of gender nonconformity in kids? Or have we just found a new way to create conformity, this time through language changes and medical transition? I had a conversation with YouTuber Jack Jewell about this recently, and he raised a really important point about how challenging it can be for gay men who fear that expressing any sort of femininity will be socially costly. And while going through childhood or adolescent years, A person might explicitly hold progressive views, but still be uncomfortable or even ashamed with his own femininity or sexual orientation. So it seems there's still a really strong need to help young would-be gay kids to accept this complex experience, especially in the social world where kids can be really cruel and sometimes it's not okay to be different. And to make matters worse, the messaging from well-meaning progressive adults these days could be, it's okay if you're different, you might be trans. If you want to hear me and Jack speak more about this, I would encourage you to check out our full interview and I'll link it below. Per Joseph, in his recent essay for GenSpect, shared his own experience of childhood gender nonconformity. At just 5 years old, he told his mom that he was a girl trapped in a boy's body. Now, this was around the year 2000. And as a kid, Per actually met 6 out of the 8 DSM criteria for childhood gender dysphoria. And yet he writes that he's glad he wasn't affirmed as trans or told he was really a girl. He grew up to be a gay man. And that trajectory of the feminine or gender dysphoric boy growing up to be gay used to be common knowledge. It was even banal to say so. But today, a very different explanation seems to come up reflexively and immediately, that a child like that is actually transgender. But I have to say, every phenomenon has both push and pull factors. So we can't lay all the blame on an overly enthusiastic, progressive acceptance or celebration of the trans kid. There's a huge cohort of people who are so allergic to any cross-sex behavior or expression that they too end up lumping gender nonconformity into the trans umbrella. Let me give you a few examples. But before I do, I need your help to keep producing videos like this. If you appreciate this kind of material, please consider becoming a paid Substack supporter. As of now, my newsletters and What's on My Mind videos like this one are completely free, but they take a significant amount of resources to produce. So becoming a paid supporter really helps out me and my team. So as I was saying, I also see a lot of conservatives participating in the phenomenon of the trans kid, just inadvertently. And I want you to think about this. What might happen when a family adheres to very rigid and traditional gender roles, and one of their children turns out to be a really feminine boy, or even a very masculine girl? One mom, Kimberly, says she spent years fighting her son's femininity. She shaved his head, and she tried to force him to wear boys' clothes, but he would not surrender. She has since come to believe that her son is actually a girl, and the child, who she now calls Kai, and the mother have made a name for themselves as activists and advocates for childhood transition. And in a way, I really feel for Kimberly. I mean, her child was explicitly asserting that he was a girl, not just showing preferences for feminine things. And it was probably really challenging and confusing for her to hear her son making such bold claims about himself. Perhaps she responded in the best way she thought possible. But now, this family has built up an entire narrative around this child being a trans girl, fighting for trans rights. This is likely to lock in this trans identity in a concrete way. But there's another, less obvious way that I see some people contributing to the trans kid idea. And it actually took me a while to figure out what was going on here. I had seen some talk online about how lots of celebrities have young trans kids. And this is often framed like the vegan cat argument. There's no such thing as a vegan cat, just owners forcing their cat to eat a vegan diet. Similarly, parents who have trans kids are often accused of Munchausen by proxy, or of making their kids be trans for attention, for scoring queer social points, or for being seen as heroic, open-minded, and enlightened parents. Personally, I feel really hesitant about attributing specific intentions to people we don't know, and I'm not a fan of calling strangers abusive towards their own children. Does abuse happen? Can it show up in some weird or surprising ways? Of course it can. But you can't assess that from afar, at least not in the vast majority of cases. Anyways, while I was looking into the trans kids of celebrities thing, I kept coming across images or headlines claiming that a celebrity has a trans kid, but then upon further investigation, the claim would fall apart. For example, in Cora, A question was posed: why do people in Hollywood have so many transgender children? And one of the most upvoted comments included this image where we see photos of several celebrities and their children. The person who posted this claimed that it is likely that they are being taught to be this way because it makes their parents look good in public. In the caption, it even says that this is an obvious example of Munchausen's by proxy. But I looked into every single one of these cases, and I have to say the graphic completely misrepresents the situation for several of these families. Megan Fox's son wears a dress in this picture, but in all the interviews I could find, she refers to him as her son. The same is true with Gwen Stefani's kid, also shown here in a skirt. Same thing with Adele's son. He's not even in girls' clothes as far as I can see. He just has bangs and longer hair. As for Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's daughter, Shiloh, she has gone through a very public exploration of different identities and presentations. Her parents described that as a small child, she wanted to be a boy and wear boys' everything. Her parents never called her trans, yet they allowed her to play with clothing, hairstyles, and even let her use a boy's nickname for some time. More recently, she's been going by her birth name, Shiloh, again, and seems perfectly comfortable in her body. To me, these are examples of parents holding their kids' gender presentation lightly, with things like hair, clothing, aesthetics, and nicknames. There was no attempt to tell the world that these kids are something they're not. So why do people jump so quickly to calling these trans kids? I think that's completely unfair and mischaracterizes what these parents might be trying to do in supporting their children's creativity and self-expression. And in a way, this graphic is transing kids who are simply gender nonconforming. Now, I think it's possible that some parents encourage their kids to break gender stereotypes or even cross-dress when that's not the child's preference. Is it possible that some people use their children to signal to the world, look how progressive and open-minded I am? Of course. All of these things are possible. People are messy. Anything is possible. And based on my research, the male children of both Charlize Theron and Naomi Watts, pictured here, are trans-identified and being raised as girls. I'm not here to judge their parenting decisions or hypothesize about what their motives are. Of course, if you've been following my work for some time, you know I have concerns about social and medical transition. But the vast majority of parents, both celebrity and otherwise, love their kids dearly and want to do what's right by them. And so I wish all these families well. We don't know what's going to happen. The big point here is this: whether someone is affirming and raising their child as the opposite sex, or accusing boys in dresses of being trans girls, we as a culture are really struggling with feminine boys. Either we change their identity so their behavior is more normative, or we view nonconforming behaviors as proof that they're really girls. Either way, what's missing is real acceptance of kids who just don't fit the mold. And you'll notice this discussion today is really focused on young boys more so than teenage girls. And I think it's particularly valuable to examine the stories of the prepubescent kids because they're almost entirely under the guidance of parents and adults. So their stories tell us a lot about the dominant sensibilities of the culture. I think these kids are like a canary in the coal mine. And I'll stand by my earlier point. Not all trans kids are gay, but most would-be gay kids are being raised as trans. So when people frame trans kids as a progressive issue, we just have to ask, progress towards what? Because to me, it looks like we've just swapped one kind of intolerance for another. We're not forcing gay kids to suppress their sexual orientation, but we are telling them to redefine themselves out of existence. Instead of recognizing that some boys are just more feminine and some girls are just more masculine, we're telling them that they have to oppose biological reality in order to be authentic. And I know some people may think, wait a minute, how can we assign a sexual orientation to a child who is prepubescent? Well, we actually can't, but we can observe the correlation between this type of gender nonconformity in childhood and the future sexual orientation that consolidates through and after puberty. So many of these are would-be gay kids that we're labeling as trans and medicalizing instead. So many people haven't really sat with this. They repeated the superficial narrative about protecting trans kids. But if nearly 90% of childhood gender dysphoria resolves naturally, why are we rushing to label and medicalize these children? Why aren't we actually protecting them and their future sexuality? Why is it so much easier for some parents, teachers, and doctors to believe that a feminine boy must actually be a girl trapped in the wrong body? And why do some people insist that a boy in a dress can't possibly be a naturally occurring phenomenon and must indicate that his parents have transed him? The message for everyone in these debates is this: please stop prematurely labeling kids. Please stop trying to box every single child into a political identity that suits your biases or proves your points. Let's make room for the natural variation in children's preferences and behaviors and give them time and space to grow up and genuinely accept themselves. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure you're subscribed to my Substack newsletter. That's the only place to get the rest of this month's newsletter, where I tell you what I've been reading, watching, and listening to. I update you about the conversations happening in my parent group, and I tell you about webinars, podcasts, and other appearances that you don't want to miss. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.